She did not cry. That is the first thing you need to know about Aurora Ravenshire. When she opened the door to the master chamber of Eldoria Hall on a cold Tuesday morning in October and found another woman lounging in her mother's bed, wearing her monogrammed silk robe, sipping tea from her grandmother's china, Aurora did not cry. She did not scream. She did not even tremble. She looked. She looked the way a general surveys enemy territory before deciding where to place the first cannon. Her eyes moved across the gilded canopy, the gold-draped curtains catching the early light, the scattered perfume bottles on the vanity that did not belong to her. Her eyes moved across Lady Amelia Kensington, who was stretched across the bed with the comfortable arrogance of a woman who had been told she had already won. And then Aurora closed the door quietly, walked back down the hallway, sat at her writing desk in the small blue morning room at the end of the east wing, and opened her leather-bound journal to a fresh page. At the top, in her neat, unhurried handwriting, she wrote 4 words. "It begins today. Signed, Aurora." What Duke Damien Blackthorne of Eldoria did not know that he had never bothered to find out in 7 years of marriage was that his wife had been quietly preparing for this moment since the 3rd year of their union. Not because she had predicted his betrayal, but because her father, the late Harrison Ravenshire, a self-made man who had built his fortune in American railroad bonds before he was ever handed a title, had raised his only daughter on one iron principle. Never let your name be the only thing protecting you. He had also left her something tucked inside a property trust so precisely worded and so thoroughly invisible to an arrogant aristocrat who had never read a contract in his life that it had sat, quiet and patient as a loaded pistol in a velvet case, for 7 full years, waiting for exactly this morning. This is not simply a story about betrayal. It is a story about what happens when a woman decides she is done being overlooked. It is about property law, financial literacy, and the cost of assuming someone will stay silent forever. It is about the kind of strength that does not announce itself until it is already too late for the people it is dismantling. It is, above all, a story about what belongs to you and what happens when you finally decide to take it back. Because we are about to take you somewhere you did not expect to go today. Greetings, gentle viewers. I trust this day finds you in good health and high spirits. We are racing toward a grand assembly of 1,000 subscribers, and your presence is most sincerely requested. Do not let this tale pass you by. Subscribe at once, bestow a like upon this record, and tell us from which corner of the globe you join us, and what hour the clock strikes in your lands. Every interaction brings us closer to our goal. Now let us return to Aurora. To truly understand what happened at Eldoria Hall in the autumn of 1887, you have to understand the man who built, or rather, inherited the problem. Duke Damien Blackthorne was, by every external measure, the kind of man rooms reorganized around. 6 feet of composed authority, black hair worn slightly longer than fashion strictly approved, and eyes the particular shade of gray that made people assume they were looking at intelligence when they were, in fact, looking at confidence. There is a difference, a significant one. Damien had never been required to learn it. He had been born into a name that opened doors before he ever knocked. The Blackthorne dukedom stretched across 4 counties, commanded 3 parliament seats, and was spoken of in London drawing rooms with a reverent hush reserved for institutions people assume will simply continue existing because they always have. Damien had grown up understanding that Eldoria Hall was his birthright, his legacy, and his proof of worth, all 3 wrapped in 4 to 6 rooms and 3,000 acres of English countryside. What he had never understood, because no one had ever asked him to, was that a name is not the same as a deed. Aurora had understood this since she was 9 years old. She had watched her own father, Harrison Ravenshire, sit across from 3 different solicitors over the course of 2 years, renegotiating the terms of the Ravenshire estate trust after a distant male cousin had attempted to contest it. Harrison had won. He always won. But the fight had cost him 2 years, a small fortune in legal fees, and most expensively the certainty that his daughter would one day face a version of the same battle, and that she needed to face it already armed. He had started teaching her to read contract the same year she learned to waltz. By the time Aurora Ravenshire became Aurora Blackthorne at the age of 22, in a ceremony that all of London society agreed was the most elegant match of the decade, She had already read the marriage settlement in full twice. She had also, quietly and without drama, noticed that the property annex on page 9, paragraph 3, was missing a clause. She had said nothing. She had signed. She had smiled at her new husband across the altar at St. George's, Hanover Square. And she had thought, we will see. 7 years later, she was still seeing. The marriage had not been cruel. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said of it. Damien was not a man who raised his voice, or his hand, or even, particularly, his expectations of her. He was simply a man who had filed his wife neatly into the category of things that were reliably present and therefore did not require active attention. Aurora was the Duchess. She managed the household with the kind of effortless precision that invisible competence always looks like from the outside. She hosted his dinners. She dressed impeccably. She spoke well and listened better. She was, by every society measure, a credit to the Blackthorn name. She was also completely, comprehensively alone. She had noticed Lady Amelia Kensington approximately 14 months before the morning she found her in the bed. Not because Damien had introduced them, he had not, but because Aurora had the particular attention of someone who has learned that what people choose not to say is always more informative than what they do. Amelia Kensington was the second daughter of a minor Yorkshire baron who had run through his inheritance with such efficient speed that the family home had been sold by the time Amelia turned 18. She was blonde in the particular way that men with old money found reassuringly uncomplicated, possessed of a laugh that carried across rooms, and entirely untroubled by the kind of internal monologue that might have suggested consequences existed. Aurora had watched her appear at 3 consecutive dinner parties in the autumn of 1886. She had watched the way Damien's eyes tracked her across a room, not with lust, exactly, though that was certainly present, but with the specific, almost nostalgic longing of a man who wanted to feel, again, like he was choosing something rather than inhabiting it. She had not been surprised. She had been, if she was honest with herself, almost relieved. Because the moment Damien made a move she could not overlook, she could begin to move herself. The morning she opened the master chamber door and found Amelia, she had already been awake for 2 hours. She had already reviewed the Ravenshire Trust documents, which live in a locked mahogany box in the bottom drawer of a writing desk, the key to which she wore on a chain beneath her dress where it rested against her sternum like a small, cold promise. She had already composed, in her head, the order of operations. She had already decided that she would give herself exactly 3 days of appearing to notice nothing, because 3 days was long enough to accomplish everything she needed to accomplish without anyone in the household growing suspicious. What she had not decided, and what she sat with for a long time in the blue morning room after closing that door, was whether she felt anything about it. She did. Of course she did. She felt the particular grief of a woman who has spent 7 years hoping that the man she married might eventually look up from his own reflection and notice she was standing there. She felt the sharp, clean anger of someone who has been patient past the point of patience and has arrived, at last, at the far side of it. She felt the strange, disorienting relief of certainty because whatever she had been living in for 7 years, it was finally over now, and she could stop waiting for it to become something else. She also felt, beneath all of that, a quiet, cold, deeply focused energy that her father had recognized in her since childhood and had never been able to name precisely. It was the feeling of a woman who has already won and is simply taking the time to do it correctly. Harrison Ravenshire had been born James Harrison Cole in a 2-room house in Philadelphia in 1831. He had renamed himself at 30, after the fortune was made and the title purchased, because he understood that the world rewards reinvention when the reinvention is sufficiently funded. He had made his money in railroad bonds and land speculation, 2 industries that rewarded the same skill in different forms, the ability to see what something would be worth before anyone else did. He had brought that skill to England with him when he emigrated at 35, purchased the Ravenshire estate in Wiltshire, acquired his title through a perfectly legitimate purchase from a government that needed revenue, and set about building a life that would outlast him. He had done it all with Aurora watching. She had been 7 when he first explained to her what a trust deed was. Not the legal specifics, she was 7, but the concept. He had sat her down at his enormous mahogany desk, the one that smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco and the particular weight of decisions, and he had said, "A trust is a promise the law makes to keep on your behalf, even when you cannot keep it yourself. It means no one can take what belongs to you, even if they say the right words or have the right name." She had asked him who might try to take things. People who assume that belonging to them is the same as belonging to you. She had not understood it fully then. She had understood it completely by the time she was 19. Harrison Ravenshire had died in the winter of 1879, 11 months before Aurora's wedding. He had spent the last year of his life doing three things: reviewing his estate documents, drinking rather too much brandy by the fire, and writing in a journal that he left, deliberately and without explanation, on Aurora's writing desk the morning of his funeral. She had found it when she returned from the church. She had read it over 3 days. She had wept on the first day, catalogued on the second, and made decisions on the third. There were many things in the journal. It was a record of his business dealings, a meditation on the difference between wealth and security, and an extensive and occasionally profane commentary on the English aristocracy's collective inability to read contracts before signing them. But it was also, tucked into the last 12 pages, a precise and meticulous guide to the legal structures he had built around the Ravenshire assets, including the one he had never mentioned to Damien Blackthorne or his solicitors: the Eldoria Hall Property Trust. Harrison had purchased Eldoria Hall 6 months before the Blackthorne-Ravenshire wedding. He had purchased it quietly, through a series of land transactions routed through the Ravenshire estate accounts, from the estate of Damien's late uncle, who had needed to liquidate assets rather quickly and had been deeply grateful for a buyer who asked no questions. He had then transferred the deed of Eldoria Hall into a property trust registered solely in Aurora's name. Not the Duchess of Eldoria, not Mrs. Blackthorne, not the wife of any duke. Aurora Margaret Ravenshire. Her name, her trust, her deed. The trust had been designed by two of the finest American property lawyers money could retain in 1879, and reviewed by a third who specialized in English marital property law. It was ironclad. It was uncontestable. It had been structured specifically to survive the doctrine of coverture, the English legal principle that, upon marriage, a woman's legal identity merged with her husband's, and her property became his. Harrison had anticipated that doctrine the way he anticipated everything, by rooting around it before it could apply. The trust predated the marriage. The property had never been part of the Blackthorne estate. Damien had signed the marriage settlement, a document that contained, on page 9, paragraph 3, a brief and precisely worded property annex that confirmed Aurora's personal holdings were excluded from the marital estate without reading past page 4. His solicitor had flagged the annex. Damien had waved the concern away. She's a woman with a dead father and a good name. What is she going to do with the property? It was, as it happened, the most expensive question he would ever ask. Here is what viewers at home should understand, because this is the part of the story that matters beyond its drama. A property trust is a legal structure in which the ownership of an asset is held by the trust, not by an individual for the benefit of a named beneficiary. In Aurora's case, she was both the trustee and the beneficiary, meaning she controlled the asset and received all benefits from it. This structure, combined with the premarital registration of the trust, placed Eldoria Hall entirely outside the reach of the marital estate. In simpler terms, it was hers. Completely. Always. And no one, not a duke, not a court, not a parliament seat could change that without her signature. Her father had understood something that Damien Blackthorne, for all his bearing and bloodline, had never been required to grasp. Paper outlasts people, and the right paper, signed in the right place, is worth more than any title in the world. Aurora had not forgotten a single word her father wrote. She gave herself exactly 3 days. The first day, she managed the household as though nothing had changed because for everyone in Eldoria Hall except herself, nothing had. She met with Mrs. Seaphina, her housekeeper, at the usual hour of 9 o'clock in the small linen room off the back corridor, and they reviewed the week's requirements with the efficiency of two women who had been doing this long enough to have developed something that was not quite friendship, but was considerably warmer than professional courtesy. Mrs. Seaphina had been housekeeper at Eldoria Hall for 11 years. She had served the Blackthorn family for 8 of those years, and Aurora for 7. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 53 with gray hair pulled back so severely it appeared to be pulling the rest of her face with it, in a manner that combined complete discretion with an absolute incapacity to pretend she did not notice things. She noticed things. She had noticed Lady Amelia Kensington's luggage being carried to the East Corridor 4 days ago. She had said nothing, because Mrs. Seaphina understood that timing was everything, and it was not her place to speak before the Duchess did. When Aurora arrived at the 9 o'clock meeting on the first morning after the door, Mrs. Seaphina looked at her employer carefully, measuring the attention of someone taking a temperature without a thermometer. Aurora looked back at her and said, with perfect calm, "We will need fresh orchids for the blue sitting room. And please see that the guest wing linens are changed on Thursday. Lady Kensington will require clean accommodations." Mrs. Seaphina did not blink. She wrote it down. But on her way out of the linen room, she paused in the doorway. "Your Grace, shall I have Mr. Hawkins look at the east gate? It has been sticking." The east gate was the gate that led to the road that connected to the main road to London. Aurora looked at her for one long, considered moment. "Yes, have it looked at immediately. I expect I'll be using it." It was the only conversation they had about any of it for 3 days. On the second day, Aurora went to London. She took the unmarked Ravenshire carriage, which was still registered under her family name and had never been transferred to the Blackthorn accounts. She wore a dove-gray traveling dress and a hat with a brim deep enough that it was not precisely hiding her face so much as discouraging investigation into it. She told no one in the house where she was going, because no one in the house had asked where she was going in approximately 4 years. She made 3 visits. The first was to Mr. Nathaniel Sterling, her father's property solicitor on Gray's Inn Road, a meticulous, measured man of 58 who had been expecting her call for considerably longer than she had been making it. He greeted her in his private office with the contained energy of someone who has spent years maintaining neutrality and is enormously glad to finally be off duty. "Your Grace, I confess I have been expecting this." "I know you have, Mr. Sterling. Are the documents ready?" "They have been ready for 18 months. She spent 4 to 5 minutes reviewing the trust documents with him. Then she asked 3 questions, received 3 precise answers, and stood to leave. "Proceed as we discussed. Timeline, 12 days. "Understood. And the Duke?" "Will be the last to know, as is appropriate." The second visit was to a private estate agent on St. James's Street whose client list was so discreet it was functionally invisible and whose commissions were therefore enormous. The third was to Drummond's Bank on Charing Cross, where the Ravenshire Trust account sat untouched and quietly vast, accumulating interest with the patient indifference of money that knows it is safe. She was back at Eldoria Hall in time for dinner, during which Damien remarked that she seemed distracted. "You've been quiet today, Aurora. More than usual." She looked across the candlelight at him at the easy posture, the handsome face, the absolute, unconscious certainty of a man who has never had cause to second-guess his position in a room. "I've been thinking about property law." He laughed. He genuinely laughed, as though she had made a charming, eccentric joke. "Good heavens! What on earth is it?" She smiled and reached for her wine-glass. "Academic interest." On the third day, she met with Mr. Alaric Nightingale. She had been directed to Nightingale by the estate agent, who had described him as a man of considerable means, impeccable discretion, and an unusual respect for the history embedded in Old English properties. Nightingale had made his fortune in manufacturing, specifically in the production of precision agricultural equipment, the kind that had transformed farming productivity across 3 continents and made him, quietly and without ceremony, one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was 51, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to fill a room with noise in order to command it. He was also, Aurora noted immediately, a man who looked at things rather than past them. He looked at her the way he would look at a contract, with full attention, without assumptions. She found it enormously refreshing. They met at the estate agent's office, with Mr. Sterling present. Nightingale had been given the property details and valuation 2 days prior. He had reviewed them thoroughly. He opened the conversation with the direct efficiency of a man who respects both his time and yours. The estate is registered in a premarital trust. The title is clean. The current occupants have no legal claim to challenge a sale. Correct. And the Duke signed away his claim on the 14th of April, 1880. Page 9. Paragraph 3. Nightingale studied her for a moment. He never read the settlement. He read the first 4 pages. There was a brief, considered silence. And then Nightingale said, with the quiet gravity of a man who has built everything he owns by reading every page of everything placed before him, "My offer is full valuation. I want it preserved. The glass houses, the portrait gallery, all of it." Aurora looked at him steadily. "The portrait in the east chamber. The one of the women in the ivory dress. Stay with you." She nodded. "Then we have an agreement." The sale was completed in 6 days. Mr. Sterling moved with the focused efficiency of a man who has been waiting 11 years to do something and is making excellent use of the time. The deed transferred from the Ravenshire Trust into Mr. Alaric Nightingale's name on a Friday morning. The formal notice of vacant possession requiring all current residents to vacate Eldoria Hall within 30 days was prepared, signed, sealed, and dispatched by the close of business the same afternoon. Damien received his copy on Saturday morning at breakfast. Aurora was not at breakfast. She had taken her tea in the walled garden, wrapped in a charcoal wool coat, watching the rooks in the copper beeches, listening to the particular quality of mourning that belongs to people who have already made their decision and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Mrs. Seaphina came to find her at 9:20. Her face was doing the careful, controlled thing it did when she was managing a great deal of information with limited visible space. "His Grace has received a document, Your Grace." "Has he?" "He is in the entrance hall. There has been a vase." Aurora considered this. "Which vase?" "The blue one from the mantel in the morning room." She set down her tea. "That was his grandmother's. Tell him I will come in when I have finished my walk." She finished her walk. Damien was standing in the center of the entrance hall when she came in through the oak doors. He was holding the notice in one hand, and his face had lost every layer of the composed, authoritative expression it typically wore as naturally as other men wore overcoats. What was underneath was something Aurora had never seen there before. It was bewildering. Real, unguarded, stripped-back bewilderment. The kind that happens when the ground does not simply shift but turns out to have been different from what you believed for the entirety of time you were standing on it. He looked, for the first time in 7 years, like a man rather than a duke. She thought it might have been quite something. Once. The man underneath. She thought she might have loved him if he had ever let her meet him properly. She filed that thought away and kept her face exactly as it was. "Aurora." "Good morning, Damien." "This document." "Yes. It says that Eldoria Hall has been sold." "It has." He stared at her. The paper trembled slightly in his grip. Not with anger, the anger would come later, but with the shock of a man who has just discovered that the floor he has been walking on belongs to someone else. "You cannot sell this house. This is the Blackthorn seat. This house has been in my family. It has never been in your family, Damien. Technically, legally, and on every document that exists. It was purchased by the Ravenshire estate 6 months before our wedding, held in a property trust registered in my name, and excluded from the marital estate in the settlement you signed on the 14th of April, 1880. Page 9. Paragraph 3. You are welcome to verify it. The silence that followed was enormous. Some way upstairs, faintly, through the ceiling, came the sound of Lady Amelia Kensington requesting her morning chocolate from a housemaid who had submitted her resignation 4 days ago and was serving out her last week with the professional correctness of someone who has already mentally left. "You planned this. I prepared for this. There is a difference. Planning implies I wanted it. Preparing implies I understood it might happen and decided not to be destroyed by it." Damien's jaw tightened. "The accounts. Without this estate as collateral. Yes, I know." That stopped him, because here was the second thing Damien did not know about his wife. She had known about the accounts for 3 years. She had found the discrepancies in the estate manager's quarterly reports on a wet November afternoon in 1884, tucked inside a folder Damien had left on his desk without locking away, because the folder, like Aurora, had not seemed to him like something that required active security. She had sat with those numbers for a long time. She had cross-referenced them against 3 years of household accounts, the property mortgage statements, and a single letter from the London branch of the Blackthorne family solicitors that she had intercepted, read, resealed, and replaced without a word. And she had understood, with the same cold, clear precision with which her father had taught her to read a balance sheet, exactly what she was looking at. The Blackthorne fortune was not what society believed it to be. The matched carriage horses, the renovated drawing rooms, the emerald necklace Damien had gifted Lady Amelia at Christmas, a gift whose receipt Aurora had found folded inside a copy of the Times in his study, the hunting parties and the London memberships, and the effortless, constant social performance of a man who could afford to be generous. None of it was funded by ancestral wealth. It was funded by debt. Lead, compounding, strategically obscure debt that had been accumulating since before their marriage, and that had been kept invisible by one thing and one thing only: Aurora's dowry, and the estate's collateral value. The moment she stepped out of the frame, the debt would have nowhere to hide. She had said nothing for 3 years because she had not yet decided what to do. And a woman who speaks before she is ready gives away the only advantage she has. She was ready now. Damien, I know about the accounts. I have known for 3 years. I know about the Whitmore credit line, the second mortgage on the Yorkshire properties, and the letter from the Blackthorne solicitors dated the 3rd of March, 1885, recommending you consolidate before the debt structure became untenable. He went very still. You know, I'm my father's daughter. He taught me to read a balance sheet before he taught me to dance. The entrance hall of Eldoria Hall was large and cold and full of the sound of a man realizing, all at once, that the woman who had been standing in his house for 7 years had understood everything he thought he had hidden, and had been waiting, with the patience of someone who knew the law was on her side, for the right moment to use what she knew. Aurora saw something move across his face in that moment that she had never seen there before. Recognition. Not remorse, though remorse was present at the edges. No shame, though, that was there too. Recognition. The belated, unguarded, genuinely devastating recognition of a man who has spent years moving through a room without looking at what was in it, and who has just, in the precise moment of its irreversible loss, understood what the room contained. Aurora. I did not. I know you did not. She said it without anger. She meant it without softness. That is the exact nature of the problem, Damien. You never intended anything in my direction. Not cruelty, not consideration, not the simple ordinary act of looking at me properly. I was in this house the way this wallpaper is in this house. Familiar, useful, entirely beneath active thought until the morning you discovered I could be moved. He had nothing to say to that. She had not expected him to. Lady Amelia Kensington came downstairs at 11:30. She had taken her time because Amelia, it must be said, had an excellent instinct for sensing atmospheric shifts and an equally excellent instinct for not acknowledging them until she absolutely could not avoid it. She descended the main staircase of Eldoria Hall in a pale blue morning dress that had cost more careful selection than it appeared, her golden hair arranged with the relaxed perfection of a woman who wants you to believe she woke up this way. She found the Duke standing alone in the entrance hall. Aurora was gone. She had not made a dramatic exit. She had simply collected the small leather traveling case that Mrs. Seaphina had left beside the door, packed 5 days ago, with the quiet deliberateness of a woman who had been mentally leaving a place long before her body followed, and walked through the oak doors into the pale October morning without looking back. Amelia looked at Damien. She looked at the paper in his hand. She looked at his face. She was not a stupid woman. Whatever her other qualities, she possessed a clear-eyed practical intelligence that had served her very well for the past 30 years in circumstances that had not always been particularly forgiving. She had spent 14 months positioning herself as the future of the Blackthorne name. She had done the calculation carefully. The Duke, the estate, the title, the London house, the social position. She was now doing a different calculation. Damien, what has happened? He looked at her for a long moment. In this particular way, she would later reflect on a man who is seeing something for the first time and is not especially pleased by what he finds. The estate has been sold. Aurora has gone. The accounts are complicated. Amelia absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone running a very rapid mental spreadsheet. Sold. The estate has been sold. Yes. Eldoria Hall. Your seat. Her seat. As it transpires. The pause that followed this was quite long. And the London house. The lease expires in January. It will not be renewed. Amelia looked at him for exactly 3 seconds longer. Then she said, with the breezy composure of someone who has decided to treat catastrophic news as a minor inconvenience she has already moved past. Well, I believe I shall go and visit my aunt in Bath. The autumn air does wonders for one's complexion. She was gone within the hour. She left behind 2 trunks of clothing in the east chamber, a set of monogrammed stationery that bore Aurora's initials, and no forwarding address. Mrs. Seaphina stood in the doorway of the east chamber after the carriage departed and looked at the abandoned luggage for approximately 15 seconds. Then she turned, walked calmly to the small linen cupboard at the end of the corridor, and allowed herself, in complete privacy, to smile. It was the first smile she had permitted herself in 4 months. It was, she felt, extremely well-earned. The weeks that followed reshaped Damien's world with the impersonal efficiency of arithmetic. There is no drama in mathematics. Numbers do not carry grudges. They simply are. The creditors who had extended patience to the Duke of Eldoria because the Duke of Eldoria with a wealthy wife and a prestigious country seat was an entirely different proposition from the Duke of Eldoria with neither became considerably less patient. Letters arrived. Then solicitors. Then the particular brand of polite but implacable representative who shows up when letters and solicitors have not been sufficient. Damien sold things. He did it methodically, without drama, with the controlled dignity that men of his breeding reserve for their most private humiliations. He settled the most pressing obligations. He gave up the Mayfair townhouse. He took modest rooms in Kensington rooms that were perfectly respectable and perfectly uncomfortable and bore absolutely no resemblance to the 4 to 6 rooms of Eldoria Hall. He appeared at his club less frequently. When he did appear, he was reported to be quieter than before, older in some quality that had nothing to do with the calendar. He wrote to Aurora in January. The letter was 2 pages long. Mr. Sterling forwarded it to her in Wiltshire without comment, in an envelope with the Ravenshire wax seal, which Aurora thought was a small but precise kindness. She read it twice by the fire in her father's library, the room that smelled of cedar and old paper and the particular weight of decisions, the room where she had been taught that paper outlasted everything. The letter contained no justifications, no requests, no appeals to sentiment or shared history or the 7 years of a marriage that had been, in its way, a real thing, even if it had not been enough. It was a direct and honest accounting of his failures, written with the same precision he brought to everything when he chose to deploy it, which he had simply never chosen to deploy in her direction. It ended with 1 sentence. I see now what I had. I am sorry I required losing it to understand. She sat with that sentence for a long time. It was the truest thing he had ever written to her. It had arrived 7 years and 1 house too late, and the coexistence of those 2 facts was more painful than any anger she had felt. She did not write back, not because she was pitiless. She had never been that, but because some reckonings, unlike debts, cannot be restructured. Some things, once released, do not return and ought not to be asked to. She set the letter in the cedar box beside his photograph from their wedding day, which she kept not out of sentiment, but because her father had taught her to keep records of everything. Then she turned to her desk. There was work to be done. The Ravenshire estate in Wiltshire had been in her family, her father's name, her mother's memory, her own beginning for 22 years. It was a different kind of house from Eldoria. Where Eldoria was grand in the calculated, performative way of aristocratic seats designed to communicate power, Ravenshire was beautiful in the way of places that have simply been loved well for a long time. The gardens were her mother's work, or had been, before her mother died when Aurora was 12. Harrison had maintained them faithfully for the 12 years he lived after that, not because he was a man of particular horticultural interest, but because he believed that the places where people have loved each other deserve to be kept. He had written about this in his journal, and Aurora had underlined the passage 3 times. Neglect is a form of erasure, and what is erased cannot be recovered. She had come back to Ravenshire on a Monday in late October, 7 days after walking out of Eldoria Hall. She had come back with one traveling case, a mahogany box of trust documents, and the particular clarity of someone who has shared everything that was not hers and is standing, finally, in what is. Mrs. Seaphina had followed. This was not discussed. It was simply a fact that presented itself. On the Friday after Aurora's departure, Mrs. Seaphina had informed the remaining Eldoria Hall staff that she would be resigning her position, had overseen the orderly handover of household records to the estate agent managing the transition to Mr. Nightingale's ownership, and had arrived at Ravenshire the following Monday with 2 trunks, her household management ledgers, and a cutting from one of the Eldoria orchid houses. I brought the yellow one. Your mother cultivated that strain. I know she did. Thank you, Mrs. Seaphina. The north wing wants airing. We will open it. The north wing had been shuttered since her mother's death 22 years ago. Aurora had left it closed because, for a long time, grief needs somewhere to live. But she was done with it being closed now. She instructed the Wiltshire staff to open it, air it, and begin the restoration process with the particular care that rooms long shut deserve, slowly, respectfully, without rushing the light back in. She also wrote to the architect she had engaged in October, commissioning the full restoration of the north wing. She specified that the work was to use original materials where possible, that nothing was to be changed that did not need to be changed, and that the room that had been her mother's sitting room was to be restored last and most carefully. Mr. Alaric Nightingale wrote to her in November. He had begun his restoration of Eldoria Hall, he said, and was finding it a remarkable property. He had also found, in the course of clearing the east chamber, a portrait that he believed did not belong to the house. It arrived at Ravenshire in a crate on the first Wednesday of December, packed with the care of something that someone understood was both precious and fragile. With it was a handwritten note in a direct, spare hand. This does not belong to the house. It belongs to you. A Nightingale. It was the portrait of her mother, the one that had hung in the east chamber for 22 years, the only surviving full-length portrait of a woman Aurora had loved and lost at 12, painted the year before she died, in the ivory dress she had worn to the Ravenshire Summer Ball of 1867. Aurora had it hung in the north sitting room, in the wall that caught the afternoon light at the angle that made the painted eyes seem, in certain moments, alive. She stood before it for a long time. The afternoon it was rehung. Mrs. Seaphina stood in the doorway, watching. Neither of them spoke. After a long while, Aurora turned from the portrait, sat at the writing desk by the window, the same desk her father had sat at, the one that smelled of cedar and decisions, and picked up a pen. There was, she had decided, a great deal left to do. She had been contacted, in the weeks following her departure from Eldoria, by 4 different women. 2 were wives of men in Damien's social circle, who wrote with the cautious, heavily coded sympathy of women who recognize a situation and cannot quite bring themselves to name it aloud. One was the daughter of an old family friend in Bath, who had heard something of what had happened and wrote to express admiration in terms that were so carefully oblique Aurora had to read the letter twice to confirm it was admiration and not condolence. The 4th letter was from a woman she had never met, a Mrs. Josephine Carroll of Mayfair, widow, as it happened, of a property attorney, and herself a woman who had recently navigated the sale of an estate that had been claimed by her late husband's brother on the basis of an inheritance dispute that had, ultimately, not survived contact with the correct legal documentation. Mrs. Carroll's letter was not careful or oblique. It was direct. I have heard what you did. I would very much like to know how you did it. Not for myself the matter is resolved, but because I am certain I am not the only woman in England who is sitting inside a legal arrangement she has never fully examined, and I believe that is something that should be addressed before it becomes catastrophic for more people than it needs to. If you would be willing to speak with me, I would be deeply grateful. J. Carroll. Aurora read that letter 4 times. Then she wrote back, I would be delighted. Come to Ravenshire. Bring whoever else you think should hear this. By February of 1888, the north wing of Ravenshire was open, aired, and half restored. The yellow orchid from the Eldoria glasshouse had been repotted and placed in the window of the morning room, where it bloomed with the quiet stubbornness of something that knows it belongs somewhere and has been waiting to prove it. Mrs. Carroll came to Ravenshire on the second Thursday in February, as promised. She brought, as Aurora had suggested she might, 3 other women. 2 were wives. 1 was a widow. All 4 of them sat in the north sitting room under the portrait of Aurora's mother, and drank tea, and listened. Aurora did not tell them what to do. That was not the point. She told them what she had known, and how she had come to know it, and what her father had taught her, and what the law actually said, and what it did not say, and where the spaces were that women had learned to overlook because they had been told, with consistent firmness, that someone else was handling it. She told them about property trusts, about premarital asset registration, about the doctrine of coverture and the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which had passed 6 years ago and which, she noted, a remarkable number of women were not aware applied to them. She told them about reading every page of every document before signing. She told them about the specific question to ask a solicitor before trusting them with anything that mattered. Can this be taken from me by someone who shares my name? She told them that the answer to that question should always be no, and that if a solicitor could not guarantee no, they needed a different solicitor. She told them about her father. She did not tell them about the entrance hall. That was hers to keep. At the end of the afternoon, Mrs. Carroll set down her tea, looked at Aurora steadily, and said, "How many women do you think are in the situation you were in?" Aurora looked back at her. "Too many to count, and most of them don't know it yet." Alaric Nightingale came to Ravenshire for the first time in March. He came with a quarterly report from the Eldoria restoration because he was the sort of man who kept his commitments in paper and had committed to keeping Aurora informed of the estate's progress since she had known it longer than anyone. He came on a Wednesday, drove himself rather than sending a carriage, arrived promptly, and accepted tea without requiring ceremony. They sat in the morning room because the north sitting room was still technically a restoration site, and because the morning room had the better light, and they talked about the Eldoria restoration for approximately 40 minutes, during which it became clear that they were both people who find genuine pleasure in the question of what a place could be, rather than simply what it had been. Then the topic shifted, as topics do when 2 intelligent people stop discussing business and start discussing what they actually think, and they talked about Harrison Ravenshire, and about the American approach to property law, and about what it meant to build something intended to outlast you. Nightingale stayed for dinner. He was invited. He did not invite himself. He came back in April and May. Mrs. Seaphina, who had watched a great deal in her 53 years and understood that the best things tended to develop slowly and with minimal drama, said nothing and kept the good china ready. Aurora was not a woman who had spent 7 years waiting for a love story. She was a woman who had spent 7 years learning, with great precision, what she actually needed. She needed someone who read every page, who listened with the same attention they brought to everything else, who understood that property was not simply land, it was intention, made permanent. She did not rush toward Alaric Nightingale. She did not need to rush. She simply found, over the course of several months of long dinners and longer conversations, that he was someone who made the room feel more honest simply by being in it. He asked her, in September, on a walk through the restored East Garden in the last of the warm evening light, whether she had given any thought to what came next. She looked at him sideways. Define next. He smiled the particular smile of a man who has decided to stop being careful because he is determined the risk is worth it. I mean the part after the dust is settled. When the restoration is done and the orchids are replanted and the north wing is open and the legal consultancy you are apparently running out of your sitting room has helped 12 women protect their assets, and your father's journal has been quietly revolutionizing how I think about property law for 6 months. What comes after all of that? She looked ahead at the garden, at the copper beeches in the last October light, at the orchid house her mother had planted and her father had maintained and she had inherited, and which was now, inexplicably and gloriously, full of yellow flowers. I expect, she said, something rather good. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked back to the house in the golden evening light, through the garden that had always been hers, into the house that had always been hers, into a life that was, at last, entirely and specifically and unambiguously hers. And it was, Aurora Ravenshire thought, returning to her name with the same quiet deliberateness with which she did everything enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly right. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever been overlooked and underestimated and assumed to be less than you are, then Aurora's story belongs to you too. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Every one of you matters in this room. Now let us close with the truth this story was always about. Outro. Harrison Ravenshire wrote in his journal that his daughter would either save the family or quietly dismantle the world. He had not considered that she might do both at once, and that both might be necessary, and that the world she dismantled might need to fall precisely, so that something more honest could be built in its place. Aurora did not think of herself as a woman who had won. Winning implies a contest entered willingly, and she had never wanted this particular contest. She had wanted, from the beginning, to be known, to be seen, to matter not as a title or a fortune or decorative proof of a man's impeccable taste, but as herself. She had been overlooked instead, and so she had done the only thing a woman of her particular, precise, architectural silence could do. She had made herself impossible to overlook, by making herself impossible to keep. What she was building now was something she had not expected, a life in which her purpose was not simply her own freedom, but the freedom of women who had not yet found their page 9, paragraph 3, who had not yet read what had been signed in their name, who were sitting, right now, in houses that may or may not belong to them, and did not yet know which it was. Aurora Ravenshire intended to make sure they found out, not through anger, not through spectacle, through the things her father had taught her, sitting at his mahogany desk in the house that smelled of cedar and decisions and the patient weight of paper. Knowledge, specifically applied, and given freely to everyone who needed it. Damien Blackthorne did not reappear in Aurora's life. He did not attempt to contest the sale. Mr. Sterling had made certain there was nothing to contest. He rebuilt his financial situation over the course of 3 years with a methodical, chastened efficiency that those who knew him found surprising and those who had known Aurora would have found entirely predictable. He remained, so far as she was aware, a changed man in the private ways that matter most, though she was not available to verify this and had no interest in doing so. Lady Amelia Kensington married a prosperous wool merchant from Leeds in the spring of 1889. She adapted to her new circumstances with the untroubled flexibility of someone who had always treated social position as a category to be updated rather than a value to be held. She was, by all accounts, reasonably content. Mr. Nathaniel Sterling retired from property law in 1891 at the age of 63, having spent his final years at the firm primarily working on the legal structures Aurora had developed for protecting women's property rights. He had found, he confided to a colleague at his retirement dinner, that this was the most satisfying work of his career. Mr. Alaric Nightingale completed the Eldoria restoration in the spring of 1889. The estate became something genuinely worthy of what it had always been called a home rather than a seat, inhabited by a man who read every page of every document and who believed that places, like people, deserved to be known properly. Mrs. Seaphina remained at Ravenshire until her retirement in 1895. The yellow orchid in the morning room bloomed without interruption for 7 consecutive years. She counted. And Aurora Ravenshire? She rebuilt. Not the way people rebuild after a storm, brick by careful brick, looking backward at what was lost. She rebuilt the way her father had built from the beginning, looking forward, looking at what could be, staying absolutely clear-eyed about what was hers and what was not, and never, ever signing anything she had not read. She taught 12 women in the first year, then 21. Then, in 1890, she published a small, precisely written guide to English property law as it pertained to women, nothing that required a solicitor to read, nothing that assumed any prior legal knowledge, simply the questions you should ask and the things you should know before you signed your name to anything. She dedicated it to her father, and beneath his name she wrote the line she had underlined 3 times in his journal. Paper outlasts people, and the right paper, signed in the right place, is worth more than any title in the world. The first printing sold out in 6 weeks. The second in 3. She was, at 32, exactly what her father had understood her to be at 7. A woman who knew what she was standing on before she stood on it. A woman who reads every page. A woman who had made herself, through patience and precision and an absolutely architectural silence impossible to overlook. She had also, rather unexpectedly and with great personal satisfaction, made herself very difficult to stop. Justice is rarely handed down. It is carved out by those with the patience to wait, the knowledge to act, and the willingness to put it in writing. Aurora Ravenshire is a reminder that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who have already won and are simply waiting for the right moment to show you the document. Know what is yours. Read what you sign. And never let your name be the only thing protecting you. We will be here next week with another story that refuses to be forgotten. Until then, stay informed, stay protected, and remember, every document you leave unread is an invitation someone else may accept on your behalf. What this story teaches. 1. Read every document before you sign it. All of it. Every page. Every paragraph. Every annex. The most expensive clause is always the one in small print that someone assumed you would overlook. 2. A property trust is a legal structure that can protect your assets from being merged into a marital estate. In the United States, this is often called a revocable or irrevocable living trust. Consult a property attorney before any major life change. 3. The Married Women's Property Act, enacted in both the U.S., state by state from the 1840s, and the U.K., 1882, changed the legal landscape for women's property rights. Know what the law says in your state or country. It matters. 4. Financial literacy is not a luxury. Knowing how to read a balance sheet, understand a contract, and identify debt that is being obscured is not optional knowledge. It is protective knowledge. 5. Silence is not the same as passivity. The most strategic people in history have often been the quietest because they were listening, learning, and preparing while everyone else assumed they were simply present. Your name on a document means something. Make sure you know what.